Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. It's great to have you with us for this event. My name is Annette Bohr, and I'm an Associate Fellow of the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. Today's roundtable discussion, which is the next in our series on Central Asia, is centered around the findings of a research paper entitled Turkmenistan, a Model Kleptocracy, that was published by the NGO Crude Accountability and authored by Thomas Main. Now, this paper is remarkable, first and foremost, for decimating important aspects of the shroud of secrecy that currently envelops Turkmenistan's governing practices. Tom's work is all the more significant, I think, in terms of filling in some of the notable gaps in our understanding of the country's internal workings, when one bears in mind the government of Turkmenistan's key modus operandi, which is to capitalize on a near complete lack of transparency in order to more readily refute legitimate grievances directed against it. And he discusses gaps that concern not only the country's internal workings. With his painstaking research, Tom exposes the hidden global side of Turkmenistan, those international networks that have ultimately made Turkmenistan the model kleptocracy that he describes so aptly in his report. Now, those of you who followed Turkmenistan over the years will undoubtedly be familiar with Tom's work. I still refer to his milestone publication for Global Witness from 2006 called It's a Gas, in which we discovered that no money from Turkmenistan's gas sales, including taxes, went to the budget. For years, Tom has undertaken groundbreaking work on the links between natural resources and corruption. I even remember when he made a cameo appearance in an episode on Turkmenistan of last week, an episode on Turkmenistan of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver on HBO. And while there's a ready supply of media reports that note the eccentricities of Turkmenistan's ruling regime, usually in a lighthearted fashion, Tom's latest research places a spotlight directly on the country's corrupt and kleptocratic practices at a time when the population has been forced to undergo an economic and humanitarian crisis that is unprecedented even for Turkmenistan. So we're holding today's event in conjunction with Crude Accountability, which is an environmental and human rights nonprofit organization based in Virginia that works with communities, activists, and organizations impacted by the development of oil and gas. Since the early 2000s, Crude Accountability has been working on Turkmenistan, researching the activity and influence of foreign corporations and international financial institutions, particularly in the oil and gas sector, but it also monitors and documents other abuses, including restrictions against civil society and the role of international institutions in supporting questionable projects in the country. I'll now introduce our speakers and quickly address a few administrative points. We'll start today with Kate Waters, who is the co-founder and executive director of Crude Accountability. Kate has been working with environmental activists in the former Soviet Union since the early 1990s. She has published numerous articles on civil society and the environmental movement in Central Asia and the Caspian region. We'll follow Kate with Tom, who is a research fellow at the University of Exeter. As I've already mentioned, Tom is a guy who knows how to trace an investigation and follow the money. His current research focuses on kleptocracy and the laundering of money by Central Asian elites. For 12 years, he was responsible for Eurasian investigations at Global Witness, an anti-corruption NGO that campaigns to end the exploitation of natural resources. Welcome to both Tom and Kate, and thank you for agreeing to join us today to share your thoughts and research findings. After both presentations, I'll open up the session for Q&A. When it comes to questions, we definitely want to know your thoughts, so please type in your questions using the chat function, or you can send them to me personally if you would like to be anonymous. Or you can raise your electronic hand in the participants tab at the bottom of your screens if you wish to ask a question live. If you have technical difficulties, please send a private message to Anna Morgan via the chat function. The first part of today's event, with the speaker's opening remarks, will be held on the record and is being recorded for Chatham House's YouTube channel. But from the question and answer session onward, we'll stop the recording and operate under the Chatham House rule. So with that, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Annette, and thank you to Chatham House for organizing this event. Thank you to all of you for being here and for joining us in this discussion of one of the world's most closed and strange countries, Turkmenistan. I wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking a little bit about why Crude Accountability decided to do this report, why we felt it was such an important piece of research to include, and also how it connects to the other work that we do. What does this report on kleptocracy in Turkmenistan have to do with environmental issues? What does it have to do with human rights? Some of this is described very aptly in chapter 4 of the report, but I wanted to sort of outline some of those issues here because I think it sort of makes some of those links that may not be self-evident. So Crude, as Annette very kindly said, we've been working in the Caspian region since 2003. We've been working in Turkmenistan since almost the start of our organization. We've done a lot of research into the impacts of oil and gas, which oil companies have been working in the region, which international financial institutions have been supporting projects there, what the impact of all of that has been on civil society. We've monitored repression particularly against environmentalists in the country, but it's become clear that, this is sort of, this is a country that has not tolerated not only an opposition, but any sort of thinking that is out of alignment with the official ideology of the government. So we have started and worked in the environmental field for a long time. We've also been, since 2013, a founding member of the Prove They Are Alive campaign, which is an international coalition of NGOs that works to document enforced disappearances in Turkmenistan, which is one of the grossest violations of human rights, and which has been ongoing for almost 20 years in the country. We have put together a list of the disappeared, which at this most recent iteration, which was published in 2019, pretty much right before the pandemic, has 121 individuals on the list. These are people who have disappeared into the prison system in Turkmenistan and whose relatives have not seen them, who have been unable to have access to medical care or legal care. They're not allowed to receive packages or letters. Their family members, their loved ones don't even know if they're alive. And the campaign has carried out a series of activities and campaign actions and international advocacy to draw attention to this gross violation of human rights. We've identified 4 categories, and I'm not going to go deeply into the disappeared, but there are 4 categories that we've identified of people who have been disappeared into the prison system. The most well-known and the longest serving disappeared are those who were accused of participating in an alleged coup attempt against former President Niyazov in 2002. Many of these people are high-level government officials. Many of them had, there were foreign ministers, foreign ministers, ambassadors, folks who were involved in the oil and gas sector, very high-level people. And about 60 of the disappeared fall into that category. There are also civil society representatives who've been disappeared. That's a small group, but a significant group. There are people who've been accused of Islamic extremism. And the group that I think is most relevant for today's discussion is people who have been accused of committing economic crimes. From the disappeared, there are 26 people on our list who have been accused of economic crimes. 13, so 50% of those people have died in prison while they have been disappeared. These are people who worked for the Ministry of Oil and Gas. These are people who were highly placed in both the Niyazov and the Berdymukhamedov regimes, who have been accused of committing pretty gross economic crimes. And Tom talks about them in the report, what some of those crimes were, what some of the violations were. But what seems to be the overriding connector among all of these people is that they fell out of favor with the regime, with the administration. They fell out of favor with either President Niyazov or President Berdymukhamedov. Many of them were accused of failing to adequately serve their function in the government or to poorly perform. Imagine being disappeared in the prison system for poorly performing at your job. And so these are the folks who have been disappeared into this prison system. And as Tom talks about, particularly the families, I encourage you to sort of remember that piece of it, that these economic crimes have been the impetus for disappearance for a large group of individuals in gross conditions. We wrote a report in 2014 about the conditions in the Turkmen prison system, and specifically in the Ovadan prison, which was created specifically for these political prisoners. And it's a very, very disturbing category. It's just gross. I want to talk also just briefly about, and Tom will touch on this in the report as well, like what does this have to do with, again, the international networks that support kleptocracy? Why does this have any connection to human rights and the outside world? What are the links there? And I'll just remind you that the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is the only international financial institution that has a political mandate, right? It's Article 1 of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is that it will work with countries that are working towards political pluralism and democracy. The EBRD, since it was founded in the 90s after the Soviet Union fell apart, has invested massive amounts of money into Turkmenistan. In comparison with some of the other countries where it invests, it's not huge amounts, but it's 292 million euro that have been invested in Turkmenistan. Currently, the EBRD has investments that are active of $54 million, and they've invested in 35 projects in the country, most of which are in the private sector. One of those projects is involved in what they call green technology. And the company that received the financing for this green technology is in the oil and gas sector and has connections to Turkmenistan, which is a state-run company. So I think there are questions about the due diligence. There are questions about where does this money go? There are questions about who actually benefits from lending from international institutions like the EBRD, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, other banks. They're not the only ones, but they're easy to single out and pick on. But given what we know about what's happening inside the country, is this really a good use of public taxpayer money? Is this really a way to enable and support the development of an economy that will benefit the people of Turkmenistan? Or is this just turning into another way for the Turkmen authorities to benefit from schemes that they can then control and take advantage of with the blessing or at least the participation of the international community? So I think there's a lot of questions about what in the end are these investments contributing to? Why is this worth doing? And what's the end result for the people of Turkmenistan? So with that, I'm going to stop and turn it over to Tom and let him sort of dive into the juicy details for you. But I wanted to sort of lay that backdrop. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that. You certainly posed some very interesting questions regarding the benefits from the lending of international institutions, and I really hope we get into that later on. And now we'll take it. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Annette. It's great to be here today, albeit online. one of the things I have missed during lockdown is the milling around at Chatham House before a meeting with a strong cup of tea, and I look forward to doing that again in the hopefully not too distant future. So Turkmenistan, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the report, but add in other elements that we didn't discuss as much in the report, to hopefully provoke some discussion later on. I think it's safe to say that the outlook for Turkmenistan isn't good. It's in its worst financial crisis in its independent history. We all know it relies on its gas exports, predominantly to China, using a gas price figure released in January this year. I think Turkmenistan is predicted to make around $6.25 billion this year, which would be the third lowest amount in terms of Chinese gas export revenue since 2013. There's of course a question mark over how much of this revenue it's actually getting, because it's paying off big debts. And there's also a question mark over increased supply to China in the future, which is what it is, what it's relying on. This money that is generated from the sale of gas goes to this foreign exchange reserve fund held in Deutsche Bank in Germany. A slight difference to Niyazov's day, 20% now reaches the budget. Now you could say that's an improvement, but if you've seen the Turkmen budget, it's 2 pages long, and there's actually no entry in it regarding how much comes from this foreign exchange reserve fund or from gas sales. So who knows whether the 20% that's supposed to come is actually hitting the budget. Now, this foreign exchange reserve fund is something I've researched for many years. It was $3 billion in Niyazov's day. The last figure we have is $35 billion in 2015. Where it is now, what level it's at, no one knows. But given the extreme financial crisis, I think it's safe to say that it is no longer at 35 billion, and it has been frittered away on these stupid projects, the airport that no one visits, the Asian Games in 2017 that no one wanted. And this is the Turkmen people's money. This is money that is generated from the sale of gas, and it clearly hasn't gone to the Turkmen people. Serdar, the son, looks like he's being groomed to be the next president. So basically, we have 30 or 40 years ahead of us of inept Berdymukhamedov family rule. Now, you might say, that this financial crisis presents an opportunity to the West. Perhaps Berdymukhamedov will finally open up the onshore gas reserves to Western companies. Perhaps he'll even build a trans-Caspian pipeline. I think to that I would say, don't hold your breath. Firstly, you have just the problem of who's going to build it. These large infrastructure projects, I think, are really a thing of the past, given the volatile prices of oil and gas. Maybe Russia and China state companies can buy it because they might take the financial hit for geopolitical reasons, but BP, Exxon aren't going to put their money in something which may not, in the end, be profitable for them. And even if, let's say, Berdymukhamedov does say, let's build a trans-Caspian pipeline, let's say the gas price goes through the roof and stays there, which makes it financially viable to build this thing underneath the Caspian. Of course, we've got the problem of Russia. Russia, who fired shots against a British boat yesterday, who 7 years ago grabbed some sovereign territory of a European nation. You think Turkmenistan is really going to anger Russia by trying to build a trans-Caspian pipeline that will undermine Russia's position in the European gas market? That is not going to happen. Berdymukhamedov is simply concerned about maintaining power, and angering Russia is not a good way of doing that. Of course, he maintains power by controlling the state resources, as I say, the big fund in Deutsche Bank. And I think it is the correct model through which to view, I think, all of the machinations we've seen over the last few years in Turkmenistan. For example, the abolition of the state agency for the management and use of hydrocarbon resources. It was abolished in 2016. I was thinking last night, what was the reason for this? And I think the idea was really when he created the state agency, was to consolidate all of Turkmenistan's oil and gas assets under one umbrella, and then basically get rid of the umbrella, get rid of the Ministry of Oil and Gas, these pesky oil and gas officials that are preventing him from controlling the oil and gas industry. And I think the abolition of the state agency has ramifications for this new entity that nobody knows anything about, this new Turkmen state oil and gas company called NAPCO. NAPCO was 90% owned by the state agency, and this is so typical of Turkmenistan, once the state agency is abolished, what happens to that 90% of shares? There was no announcement. Now, it's probable that a large part went to other state companies such as Turkmen Neft and Turkmen Gas. But from the information we have available to us, we also know that a Turkmen bank, Senegat, is a shareholder in NAPCO, and who owns the bank. So it seems like there is a kind of a hidden privatization of the Turkmen state's oil and gas industry going on. And I think Berdymukhamedov is really taking his cue from Azerbaijan. A story that I worked on, I think in 2013, was how Azerbaijan was trading its oil through this shadowy company called SOCAR Trading, which at the time in 2013 was 50% state-owned, but also had 50% private shareholding, these shadowy shareholders. There was a way of transferring what should be state-controlled business into private hands. And I think NAPCO is an example of that. So we have, I think, less transparency under Berdymukhamedov than we did under Niyazov, which is incredible to say. But I think what is also disappointing, and Kate touched on this, is the regressing of transparency on behalf of Western institutions like the EBRD and the IMF. I should point out that the EBRD was invited to join the panel today. They didn't have anybody available, which is perhaps just as well, because it means I can be a little less polite than I would be normally. Yes, it is a farce what the EBRD is doing. One quote from the most recent strategy on Turkmenistan: overall, Turkmenistan is at a very early stage of transition to a sustainable market economy. Perhaps we should just say that it's not transitioning to a sustainable market economy. But of course, the EBRD can't say that because, as Kate pointed out, Article 1 of its mandate is about working with countries that are heading towards this open market-oriented economy. The EBRD really needs to get rid of its Article 1 or stop operating in Turkmenistan. We are 30 years now from the fall of the Soviet Union, something that makes us feel, some of us feel rather old. But we know the direction now Turkmenistan is heading in, and it is not a sustainable market economy. I think the only bright note in terms of information released by these institutions is the fact that the IMF this year published its own estimation of the GDP growth in Turkmenistan, and not the bogus figure released by Turkmenistan. But it should be going much further. Why isn't it talking anymore about the foreign exchange reserve fund and the need for reform? Why isn't it publishing information on the currency reserves, which is fundamental to understand the economic situation of a country? It publishes it, and even other countries in the region. So why does Turkmenistan get a free pass just because it doesn't want to release that information? It should publish that information, and if Turkmenistan refuses, then these institutions shouldn't be working in Turkmenistan. Section 2 of the report is a bit of a greatest hits, if you will. If you know Turkmenistan, you'll know Bouygues and Itera and Polymex. But I think that's these stories are worth revisiting, I think, for 3 reasons. Firstly, and this is something I would hear a lot from my conversations with certainly European officials from the Commission and so on. They would tried to argue, well, we need to get our oil and gas companies in Turkmenistan. And then once they're there, that gives us, a reason to start talking about human rights and good governance and transparency. But everything we have in this second chapter report points to that not being the case, and the fact that companies actually get co-opted into this kleptocratic, corrupt system in Turkmenistan. The key quote I think I would cite is from one of the WikiLeaks cables, the US ambassador saying that the French embassy does not lend support to human rights issues in order not to jeopardize Bouygues. So there we have the opposite of what all these European officials are saying about the need of getting our companies in there. And I think this report also shows, this chapter shows that even something which looks relatively benign, such as gas turbines, you might say, well, when people need power, what's so bad about General Electric in this case supplying gas turbines to Turkmenistan? But if you actually look at the deals, you'll see that General Electric did it in partnership with Ahmet Çelik, the Turkish businessman, who at the very least is a close friend of the president, and at the very most is in some kind of dubious financial relationship with the president. And there is certainly evidence to suggest in the Niyazov era, there were all kinds of dubious machinations going on. So much so that Niyazov made Çelik, I think, a deputy minister of the cotton industry in Turkmenistan. So it's clear that companies that go into Turkmenistan have to be aware that it is not going to be possible to do things perhaps the way you would like. And finally, about chapter 2, I think I would just mention again Itera, or Areti, as it's now called. This was a story relayed in the It's a Gas report that Annette mentioned, but I think it's very important to repeat that story because Berdymukhamedov, the chairman of Itera Areti, is now one of the closest advisors to Berdymukhamedov, advising him on oil and gas issues. So you have the architect of this very dubious gas transit scheme, which transported in the early 2000s gas from Turkmenistan to Ukraine, the archetype of taking something that should be state business and putting it into private hands. And you have that very same figure now advising Berdymukhamedov on oil and gas issues. And I think it's no surprise that this NAPCO company should appear at the same time as Mukhamedov is advising Berdymukhamedov. Chapter 3 maps out for the first time, at least in English, the Berdymukhamedov family. He has a large family, 5 sisters. One thing you can say about Niyazov is that the damage his family can do was rather limited because he was an orphan. He was estranged from his son, and his daughter lived abroad, although as the report goes into, it's clear that money was made somewhere by those individuals. But with Berdymukhamedov, the family is much bigger. And we relate that the daughters, Gul Jahan and Ogul Jahan, were both diplomats in the UK until 2018. And I believe Ogul Jahan still is married to Dovlet Atabayev, a oil and gas official, and they are still in London. Even President Aliyev of Azerbaijan had the decency not to send Layla and Arzu, his daughters, out on diplomatic missions. But this is Turkmenistan. It is a family business. And of course, even if they weren't diplomats, we know from examples, countless examples in the region, from Kazakhstan, from the Kiev era, Kyrgyzstan, how family members are used as conduits of funds that are used to siphon money out of the country. And then if you've not read the report, I would certainly draw your attention to a section on how the Niyazov family are investing in the Checkpoint Charlie site in Berlin, a mind-boggling story that hasn't really been reported in English language media. And this is important because it shows how many years after somebody dies, in this case with Niyazov, that kind of dubious wealth can filter into European countries, and even something as historic as the Checkpoint Charlie site. Chapter 4, as Kate has said is the section on the disappeared, and it was fascinating and troubling at the same time as somebody who, for a period of years prior to this report, hadn't been looking closely at Turkmenistan, to start researching some of these figures. Yoli Gurbanmaradov, Paisi Geldimedov, and to find that they had just died in prison with no information being released whatsoever until they died. And I think the point to be made here is that it is no coincidence that a lot of these people are officials, former officials of the Turkmen government, and it shows that in a kleptocracy you don't need to falsify evidence against these guys. I mean, I'm sure that goes on, but when the system is built on creating money and sending it up the period, if you ever fall foul of that system, you just need to send the prosecutor around to their house. They'll have cars, they'll have jewelry, they'll have some money in bags, and you've got your case there, and you can arrest them and get rid of them. And this led me to thinking, why haven't we seen as many defections with such a horrible system? Why haven't we seen as many defections under Berdymukhamedov as we have under Niyazov? And I think there's perhaps two reasons I would propose for this. I think, firstly, a rather grim joke that one of my Turkmen colleagues told me, that for a man in Turkmenistan, there are three occupations you can be involved in. One is being a state official. The second is a truck driver, and the third is a drug addict. There really is no way to make money in Turkmenistan other than being a state official. And if you are a state official and manage to keep on the right side of Berdymukhamedov, you're basically a made man, as it were. And that is probably why people go into it knowing that one false move and they may be disappeared. And I think perhaps the second reason for the lack of defections is the fact that, whereas with Niyazov, a lot of those officials had been brought up in the Soviet system, they could tell that, even compared to the Soviet system, this was not right. This was even more corrupt and without the education system that the Soviet Union had provided. With these guys now in charge, they're in their 30s, early 40s. They don't have that kind of experience of what it was like under the Soviet Union, and they think it's normal. And so, why, when they are making money, would they ever speak out against the system? And the fact that, as Chapter 4 points out, there is this very Stalin style system of jailing relatives. I think you have the perfect reason for why more people don't defect from Turkmenistan. So I think that's probably all I'm going to say. Usually the most fun part of these meetings is when we get into the discussion. And with the Chatham House rule, we can perhaps be a little bit freer in what we say. So Annette, I will hand it back to you.
Fantastic, Tom. What a great scene-setting presentation. Really enjoyed that.